Elizabeth sat in the notary's office, clutching her leather handbag tightly. She still couldn't believe that her parents were gone. The accident had taken them so suddenly that she hadn't even had time to say goodbye. Mrs. Williams. The voice of Notary Peter Anderson brought her out of her thoughts. I realize this is a very difficult time for you, but we need to discuss the inheritance. Elizabeth nodded, trying to collect her thoughts. Her husband, Richard, sat next to her, his hand on her shoulder in a gesture of support. According to your parents' will, Anderson continued, unfolding the papers, you are the sole heir to all of their property. This includes the family mansion on Oak Street, shares in several large companies, and substantial bank accounts. Elizabeth felt Richard's arm tighten around her shoulder. How much money are we talking about? He suddenly asked, his voice sounding like something Elizabeth had never heard before. The notary named a figure that took Elizabeth's breath away. She felt Richard sit up straight in his chair. This is impossible, she whispered. I had no idea. Your father was a very successful businessman, Anderson explained gently, and a very careful one. He left clear instructions on how to manage the property. Darling, this is just incredible. Richard turned to her, his eyes sparkling. We'll be able to fulfill all our dreams. Elizabeth looked at her husband, and for the first time in 15 years of marriage, felt something strange. His smile seemed too wide, and his enthusiasm unnatural. Mr. Anderson, she said to the notary, trying to ignore her growing anxiety, what exactly were the instructions that my father left? It's a rather complicated document, he replied. Perhaps we should discuss it in private? In private? Richard asked sharply. I am her husband. We have no secrets from each other. Elizabeth saw the notary hesitate for a moment before answering. Of course, if Mrs. Williams doesn't mind. I don't mind, Elizabeth said quietly, though something inside her told her it was a mistake. All the way home, Richard talked non-stop, making plans, one more grandiose than the next. Elizabeth stared silently out the window. She could see her father's face in her mind's eye when he last came to visit them. He looked at Richard for a long time and then said to her, Daughter, sometimes people are not what they seem. Now, sitting in the car next to her husband, who had suddenly become so talkative and attentive, she wondered for the first time what her father meant. Can you hear me, honey? Richard's voice broke into her thoughts. I'm saying we need to go to the bank tomorrow and get everything formalized. Tomorrow? She asked again. But I haven't even gotten over the funeral yet. Elizabeth, he sounded irritated. This is serious business. You can't take this kind of money lightly. She nodded, but decided that she would call the notary back tomorrow. Something told her that her father had been so careful with his property for a reason. And now it was time for her to be careful too. 2 weeks passed after her visit to the notary. Elizabeth noticed how their house had changed. Richard began to spend less and less time there. In the evenings, she often sat alone in the living room, listening to the silence. This evening, she was alone again. The clock read 11:30 when the front door opened. You're late, Elizabeth said quietly, not getting up from her chair. Richard flinched, clearly not expecting to find her in the dark room. Darling, you scared me. Why aren't you sleeping? I was waiting for you. Another important business meeting? He nodded quickly, taking off his jacket. Yes, with potential investors. You know how it goes. I know, Elizabeth replied slowly. Only you've never had so many meetings before. Richard came over and kissed her on the cheek. He smelled of expensive perfume, but not the one she had given him. It's just that a lot of opportunities have opened up now. He tried to speak casually. By the way, have you thought about what I said? About re-registering some of the shares? Elizabeth felt everything inside her shrink. Richard has been coming back to this topic a lot these days. I'm not ready to make that kind of decision yet, she answered. It's only been 2 weeks since... Elizabeth, he interrupted her abruptly. Time does not stand still. You must think of the future. Our future? She asked quietly. Richard paused for a moment, then ran his hand through his hair. Of course, ours. Whose else's? I just want to help you with the management of all this property. You know I have business experience. Elizabeth recalled how last week she found photos of the inheritance documents on his phone. He said he just wanted to show them to the lawyer. But why didn't he ask her for a copy? Richard, she looked him in the eye. Do you remember what you said to me on our wedding day? He tensed. What exactly? You said that money would never come between us. A shadow flashed across his face. Things are changing, darling. We have a responsibility to this property now. At that moment, his phone vibrated. Richard quickly took it out, looked at the screen, and turned away. I'm sorry. I have to take this. It's important. He walked out onto the terrace, but Elizabeth caught sight of the name on the screen. Stephanie. She had never heard him mention that name before. The next morning, when Richard left for another business meeting, Elizabeth called the notary. Mr. Anderson, it's Elizabeth Williams. I'd like to meet with you, in private. Of course, Mrs. Williams. I've been expecting your call. She heard a note of relief in his voice. Expecting? Your father. He left an envelope. He said to give it to you when you called alone, unaccompanied by a man. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. I'll be there in an hour. She hung up the phone and went to the window. An unfamiliar car had been parked in the parking lot across the street for 3 days. Yesterday, she noticed Richard talking to the driver. When he came back, he said it was just a tourist who got lost. But tourists don't park in the same spot for 3 days in a row. Going upstairs, Elizabeth took an old box out of the closet. There, under the letters from her parents, was the key to a safe deposit box that no one, not even Richard, knew about. Sometimes the best defense is preparation, her father was fond of saying. Now she was beginning to understand what he meant. The Wilson party had always been one of the most important social events of the season. Elizabeth didn't want to go. Only 3 weeks had passed since her parents' deaths. But Richard insisted. Darling, we need to make an appearance in society, he said as he tied his tie. People need to see that we're sticking together. Together, Elizabeth thought, looking at her reflection in the mirror. Lately, the word had been ringing more and more hollow. The huge Wilson house was shining with lights. When they entered, Margaret Wilson, the hostess of the evening, immediately rushed to them. Elizabeth, dear, she hugged her. We are so sorry for your loss. Your parents were wonderful people. Thank you, Margaret, Elizabeth replied quietly. Richard, Margaret turned to her husband. There's a nice group of people in the library. They're talking about investments. I think you'll find it interesting. Elizabeth felt Richard tense. Darling, do you mind? He asked, but he was already moving toward the library. Of course, she replied to his back. Margaret took her arm. Come on, I'll introduce you to some new people. Recently, our society has been replenished with interesting personalities. They passed through several rooms, greeting their friends. Suddenly, Elizabeth heard laughter that made her stop. It was coming from the terrace, loud, young, confident. And then another voice, so familiar. Oh, there's Richard entertaining our young financier, Margaret said. Stephanie is just a lovely girl. She works for some investment fund. Elizabeth froze. Stephanie. The same name she had seen on her husband's phone screen. She walked closer to the open terrace door. Richard stood leaning on the railing next to a young woman in her 30s. Tall, slender, with long blonde hair, she looked like a model on the cover of a magazine. Do you really think this is possible? Stephanie asked, looking down at Richard. With the right documents, anything is possible, he answered, and his hand touched her shoulder lightly. Richard? Elizabeth stepped onto the terrace. They both turned around sharply. A shadow of irritation flashed across Richard's face, which he quickly hid behind a smile. Honey, I want you to meet Stephanie Morrison, our new financial advisor. Financial advisor? Elizabeth asked again. I didn't know we were looking for a consultant. Stephanie held out her hand. Mrs. Williams, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your husband told me about your loss. He did? Elizabeth thought. I wonder what else he told you. We were just discussing some investment opportunities, Richard quickly added. Yes, Stephanie confirmed with a smile. I have some interesting proposals. Elizabeth saw them exchange quick glances. Her father's voice rang in her head. Daughter, always trust your intuition. I need a drink, she suddenly said. Richard, will you bring me some wine? When he left, Elizabeth turned to Stephanie. How long have you known my husband? Oh, just a few weeks, she replied. but something in her eyes said otherwise. "It's a strange coincidence that you came along just as I received my inheritance." Stephanie's smile grew tense. Sometimes fate throws us unexpected opportunities. Yes, Elizabeth thought, and sometimes those opportunities turn out to be traps. She remembered the envelope she had received from the notary yesterday. It contained clear instructions from her father and a list of people she could trust. There was also a warning that big money often attracts dangerous people. On the way home, they hardly spoke. But when Richard went to the shower, Elizabeth took his phone. Now she knew what to look for. Stephanie was listed as SM consultant in the contact list. And in the call, history were dozens of conversations that had begun long before her parents' deaths. The old mansion of her parents greeted Elizabeth with the usual silence. She came here alone, telling Richard that she wanted to sort through her parents' personal belongings. In reality, she was driven by a hunch. She was sure that her father had left her more clues. She went upstairs and entered her father's study. Everything remained the same as when he was alive. A massive oak desk, antique bookcases, paintings on the walls. "Dad," Elizabeth whispered, touching the surface of the desk. "Why didn't you tell me earlier? Why didn't you warn me?" She began to methodically examine each drawer, each shelf. In one of the drawers, she found an old photo of her and her father at a graduation ceremony. He said, "Remember, daughter, the most valuable things are always hidden in the most unexpected places." Suddenly, her gaze settled on an old painting over the fireplace, a landscape she had seen thousands of times. But now something seemed strange. Pulling up a chair, Elizabeth stood up and took a closer look. The picture frame was slightly thicker on one side. "This is it," she whispered, carefully removing the painting. Behind it was a small niche, and in it was an old leather briefcase. Her hands trembled as she took it out. Inside were papers, dozens of documents, letters, and notes, neatly folded into folders. The top one read, "For Elizabeth. Open in case of danger." "Miss Williams." A sudden voice made her flinch. Martha, the old housekeeper, was standing in the doorway. "I'm sorry to have frightened you. I brought you some tea." "Thank you, Marta." Elizabeth tried to calm her heartbeat. "Tell me, how long have you been working in this house?" "Almost 30 years, miss. Since you were a little girl." "And have you noticed anything strange lately?" "Before my parents." Martha set the tea on the table and hesitated. "Your father, he often worked late in this office, especially in recent months. And once I heard him talking on the phone. He said, 'They're trying to get to her through the people closest to her.'" Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. "When was this?" "A week before the accident." Martha looked down. "And then there was one visit." "What kind of visit?" "A young woman. Very beautiful, elegant. She came to see your father, but the conversation was tense. I heard him say to her, 'Tell him that I know everything, and I will not allow you to ruin my daughter's life.'" Elizabeth clutched her briefcase in her hands. "Can you describe this woman? Tall, blonde hair?" "I think her name was Stephanie." The papers in the briefcase suddenly became heavier. Elizabeth sank into her chair. "Martha, would you mind doing me another favor? I need you to know something, but it must remain between us." "Of course, miss. You know I have always been devoted to your family." When the housekeeper left, Elizabeth opened the first folder. On the first page was a letter. "Dear daughter, if you are reading this, it means that my suspicions have been confirmed. I hesitated for a long time about telling you everything, but I decided that it was better to prepare you for possible danger. These papers contain evidence that some people have been planning to take over our property for a long time. They are patient and cunning, and unfortunately, they may be closer than you think." Elizabeth flipped through page after page. Bank statements, photographs, phone records. And then there was the dossier on Richard that her father had put together over the past year. And photos. Photos of Richard and Stephanie, dating back to last summer. The phone vibrated, a message from Richard. "Where are you? I'm worried." Elizabeth looked at the screen, and for the first time in a long time, felt not pain but anger. She remembered her father's words. "The best revenge is to let the enemy think he is winning." Everything is fine, dear, she wrote back. I'll be home soon. Closing the briefcase, she hid it in a safe place. Now she had proof, and a plan began to take shape in her mind. Lawyer Michael Donovan's office was located in the old part of town. Elizabeth entered the building at exactly 9 in the morning, just as Richard was having an important meeting with Stephanie, which he, of course, did not tell her about. Miss Williams? Donovan rose to meet her. Your father told me a lot about you. Really? Elizabeth looked carefully at the man in his 60s, with penetrating gray eyes. And did he tell you about my husband? The lawyer gestured for her to sit down. I'm afraid so. That's why I'm glad you finally come. Did you know? She took the documents she had found out of her bag. You knew about all this? Your father entrusted me with keeping an eye on certain events. Donovan chose his words carefully. He suspected that your marriage might be part of a long-term plan. Long-term? Elizabeth felt her breath catch in her throat. You mean to say? Yes, the lawyer replied gently. There is reason to believe that Richard married you for the prospect of an inheritance. The office fell silent. Elizabeth looked out the window, trying to comprehend what she had heard. 15 years, she whispered. 15 years of lies. Your father hesitated for a long time before starting an investigation. Donovan opened the safe and took out a folder. But when Stephanie Morrison showed up, who is she really? A professional fraudster. Specializes in financial fraud. We've tracked down at least 3 cases where she's helped interested parties gain control of other people's property. Elizabeth mentioned the party at the Wilsons. They don't even try to hide their relationship, because they are confident of their success. Donovan laid out the documents in front of her. Look, they have already prepared all the papers to transfer control of the companies. All they need is your signature. And then, the lawyer sighed, you suddenly become incapacitated. Stress, depression, after the loss of your parents. Richard gets the right to dispose of all your property as your legal representative. Elizabeth felt her hands tremble. They could have been involved in my parents' accident? Donovan looked at her for a long moment. We have no direct evidence, but your father did change his will a week before he died. He added special conditions that even Richard doesn't know about. What were they? If something happens to you within a year of receiving the inheritance, all the property goes to the charity. All of it, without the possibility of appeal. Elizabeth nodded slowly. So they want me to rewrite everything myself. Exactly, Donovan leaned forward. But we have an advantage. They don't know about it. And what do you propose? Your father left clear instructions. The lawyer took out another envelope. A plan that should bring everyone to the cleaners, but it is risky. Tell me, Elizabeth said firmly. We'll give them what they want. We'll let them think their plan is working, but their every move will be documented. Every meeting, every conversation. And if they get suspicious, then you will be in danger, Donovan said bluntly. People like that don't like to have their plans ruined. Elizabeth got up and went to the window. Below, the city was in full swing, with people hurrying about their business, unaware of the drama playing out nearby. You know, she said, not turning around, I keep asking myself, was I really that blind? Did I not see the signs? Don't blame yourself, Donovan replied gently. Love often blinds you, but the most important thing now is to act wisely. She turned back to the table. What should I do? For starters, you have to keep playing the part. Let them think that you don't suspect anything. Meanwhile, we'll start collecting evidence. Private Detective Thomas Brooks turned out to be the exact opposite of what Elizabeth had imagined. No coat or hat, just an inconspicuous middle-aged man in a regular suit. During the 2 weeks of surveillance, he said, spreading the photographs on the desk in Donovan's office, we recorded 12 meetings between your husband and Stephanie Morrison, not counting phone calls. Elizabeth looked at the pictures. Here's Richard and Stephanie leaving a restaurant. Here they are sitting in a cafe, bent over some papers. And this, she felt her heart clench. This is them kissing by Stephanie's car. Go on, she said, trying to stay calm. It's not just the two of them. Brooke showed her other photos. This man is Robert King, a well-known document forgery specialist in certain circles. Donovan, who was sitting next to him, looked at Elizabeth with concern. This means they are already preparing the ground for seizing control of the property. We have recordings of their conversations, the detective continued, pulling out a flash drive. I warn you, they are quite frank. He turned on the recording. Richard's voice, which she had known for 15 years, sounded cold and businesslike. It's almost done. She doesn't suspect anything. She thinks I just want to help her with her estate. Stephanie's voice answered. And if she refuses to sign? She won't. I know her weaknesses. She still believes in our love, she said with a short laugh. Can you imagine? 15 years of putting up with that boring provincial woman. Elizabeth raised her hand. Turn it off. The office fell silent. Donovan gently touched her shoulder. Are you all right? No, she answered honestly. But I will be. There's something else. Brooks pulled out a new folder. We checked Richard's background. It turns out this isn't his first project. What do you mean? 10 years ago, he was married to the daughter of a wealthy industrialist in Boston. The marriage lasted 3 years, after which the girl unexpectedly committed suicide. All the property passed to Richard as the sole heir. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. Do you think? The police closed the case as a suicide, the detective replied. But there are witnesses who saw Richard with a young blonde shortly before the tragedy. Stephanie? It's possible. There are no photos, but the description matches. Donovan stood up and walked over to the window. Do you understand now why your father was so worried? He must have found out something about Richard's past. Elizabeth looked at the evidence laid out on the table: photographs, records, documents. 15 years of her life had been a lie. What's next? She asked. They are setting a trap for you, Brooks said. But we can turn it into a trap for them. How? Keep playing the role of the gullible wife. Let them think their plan is working. Meanwhile, we'll gather more evidence. And risk me ending up like that girl in Boston? No, Donovan said firmly. This time it's going to be different. We have the advantage of knowing their plan. Elizabeth stood up and went to the window. Below, people were rushing about their business, unaware of the drama unfolding above their heads. Okay, she finally said. What do I need to do? First, Donovan took out a tape recorder. We need to record every conversation you have with Richard. And then there's something else. Before he could finish, there was a knock at the door. It was the secretary. Mr. Donovan, there's a call for Mrs. Williams. Her husband is looking for her. Elizabeth looked at her watch. She had missed their usual lunch. Tell him I was at the bank, she replied calmly. I was discussing the details of the inheritance. When the secretary left, Brooks nodded in approval. You're already starting to think like a detective. The next 2 weeks were a real test of Elizabeth's acting skills. Every time Richard hugged her, she had to hold back her disgust. His every smile now seemed like a false mask. Darling, he said one evening as he poured her wine, I think it's time we had a serious talk about the future. Elizabeth noted to herself that this was the 3rd time he had tried to get her drunk before having a serious conversation. Of course, dear. What exactly is it that's bothering you? I'm worried about you. He sat down next to her and took her hand. You've had so much responsibility lately. All these companies' bills. I wonder, Elizabeth thought, how many times he's rehearsed this speech in front of Stephanie. Yes, it's not easy, she answered, looking down. I want to help you. His voice softened. You know, I talked to Stephanie. With Miss Morrison? Elizabeth asked innocently. Yes, with our financial advisor. She suggested a very interesting asset management scheme. Elizabeth remembered the detective's warning. They will try to conduct the transaction through shell companies. Don't agree right away, but show interest. What kind of scheme? She asked, trying to make her voice sound tired. Richard perked up. It's brilliantly simple. We set up a management company, transfer all the assets there. But why? She interrupted. Isn't it easier to manage everything directly? Honey, he stroked her cheek. You don't know all these financial details. Let me take care of it. This is it, Elizabeth thought. This is exactly the moment Donovan was describing the first attempt to take control. I guess you're right, she sighed. I've been so confused lately. I know, my love. He held her close. That's why I want to help. Tomorrow I'll bring the documents. You just have to sign them. Tomorrow? She pulled away. But I have a meeting with my father's lawyer. She noticed his face tense. What lawyer? I don't remember the name. She lied. Something about additional papers for the inheritance. Cancel the meeting, he said sharply. I'll take care of it myself. But, Elizabeth. He raised his voice, then quickly composed himself. I'm sorry, my dear. I just want to protect you from unnecessary stress. She lowered her head, hiding her eyes. Okay, I'll cancel. Later that evening, when Richard left for an urgent business meeting, Elizabeth called Donovan. They're taking action. Tomorrow they will bring the documents. We are ready, the lawyer replied. Are the cameras installed? Yes. She looked back at the small lens hidden in the wall clock. Everything is working. It's great. Don't sign anything tomorrow. Tell him you want to show the papers to your financial advisor. And if he insists, then say you need time to think about it. Play on his patience. He doesn't want to arouse suspicion. Elizabeth went to the window. She spotted a familiar car on the street Detective Brooks was watching the house. You know, she said, sometimes I wake up at night and think, is this really happening to me? Has the man I've lived with for 15 years turned out to be a monster? Donovan suggested gently. Unfortunately, such people exist. They are experts at manipulation and deception. How could he? Her voice trembled. 15 years. Was it all a lie? Focus on the main thing, the lawyer said firmly. We have to stop them, not only for your sake, but also to prevent more victims. You're right. She wiped away a tear that had fallen. What else do I need to know about tomorrow? Be careful with your drinks. They might try to put something sedative in them. Keep your phone on, and most importantly, don't show that you know everything. After the conversation, Elizabeth stood by the window for a long time. Somewhere in the city, Richard is now planning with his mistress how best to deceive her, and she is preparing a trap for them. Dad, she thought, you were right. Sometimes the best defense is offense. The morning began with a surprise. Richard brought her coffee in bed. This hadn't happened in years. What's the occasion? Elizabeth asked, carefully taking the cup. Can I pamper my beloved wife? He smiled and sat down on the edge of the bed. Elizabeth noted to herself that the coffee smelled different than usual. She remembered Donovan's warning and pretended to take a sip. It's delicious, thank you. I have some great news today. Richard took a folder out of his briefcase. I've prepared everything for the re-registration of the assets. You're in a hurry, darling, Elizabeth thought. Right now? She stretched, pretending to be sleepy. Shall we have breakfast first? Time is short, darling. We have to be there before the bank opens. She picked up the papers and started flipping through them. It was exactly as Donovan had warned her, a complex scheme to transfer rights through several shell companies. Richard, she looked up, why does it mention an offshore company? It's for tax optimization. He quickly took the document away. Don't fill your beautiful head with such complicated things. But, honey, he took her hand. Trust me. I know what I'm doing. At that moment, her phone rang. It was a conditioned signal from Brooks. I'm sorry, she said as she answered. Yeah? What? But how? Richard watched her intently. It's the bank, she explained, hanging up the phone. They say there's some problem with the inheritance papers. I need to get there immediately. I'll come with you. No. She realized that she had answered too abruptly. I mean, you have a meeting with Stephanie? With Miss Morrison today? He was confused for a moment. How did you... You told me yesterday, she quickly corrected him. About the investment consultation. Oh, yes. He was clearly relaxed. Indeed, the meeting was important, but maybe... Don't cancel it. Elizabeth got out of bed. I'll handle the bank myself. And the documents? Let's discuss everything calmly in the evening? She saw a shadow of irritation flicker in his eyes, but he quickly composed himself. Of course, my love. As you say. When she left the house, Brooks was waiting around the corner. Did he buy it? I think so, Elizabeth replied as she got into the car. But something tells me he's going to check. Don't worry, the detective started the engine. Our people are already at the bank. If he calls, they'll confirm your story. What about Stephanie? She's at the Plaza Hotel right now. She's waiting for him. Brooke showed the photos from the hidden camera. They look nervous. Something didn't go according to their plan. What exactly? Perhaps it was that mysterious call Richard received last night. Elizabeth is on alert. What call? We weren't able to record the conversation, but afterwards he had an urgent meeting with King, the same document forgery specialist. They drove up to Donovan's office. The lawyer was waiting for them in the conference room. It's good that you've come. We have some news. What news? It looks like they're planning something more than just a document fraud. He spread new photos on the table. Take a look. The pictures showed Richard handing a package to a strange man outside a pharmacy. We checked this guy out, Brooke said. He's known in certain circles, a specialist in specialty drugs. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. This morning, Richard brought me coffee. Did you drink it? Donovan asked sharply. No, just a good cup. But why? They're in a hurry, the detective interrupted. Something scared them. Perhaps they learned of the special terms of the will? It's unlikely, the lawyer objected. This information is well protected, but in any case, we need to act quickly. Elizabeth looked at her phone. 3 missed calls from Richard. What do I do next? They'll try again tonight, Donovan said. Be prepared. And remember, we know now that they are capable of anything. Day X came unexpectedly quickly. Elizabeth stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her earrings, the same ones Richard had given her for their 10th wedding anniversary. She now knew that he had taken the money for them from his previous wife's account. Are you ready, honey? Richard appeared in the bedroom doorway. The bank is waiting for us. Yes. She took one last look at her reflection. I'm just a little nervous. Everything will be fine. He came over and put his arm around her. Just trust me. There was such sincerity in his voice that if she didn't know the truth, she would believe him again, just like she had for 15 years. On the way to the bank, Richard was unusually silent. He called someone only once. Yes, we're on our way. Everything is according to plan. Elizabeth knew who he was calling. Stephanie was already waiting at the bank, ready to play the role of independent financial advisor. At the bank's entrance, they were greeted by a manager, the same one Donovan had warned them about. Mrs. Williams, Mr. Williams, welcome. We have prepared a separate room for the meeting. Stephanie was already sitting in the spacious office. When she saw them, she smiled professionally. Good morning. I have prepared all the necessary documents. Miss Morrison has so kindly agreed to help us with the paperwork, Richard explained, noticing Elizabeth's surprised look. This is very unexpected, she replied, sitting down at the table. Stephanie spread out the papers. It's very simple, Mrs. Williams. You just sign here and here. May I read them first? Of course, Stephanie answered quickly, but Elizabeth noticed her glance at Richard. Shall we have some coffee? Richard suggested. I'll bring it myself. Coffee again, Elizabeth thought. What is it this time? Thank you, dear. While he went to get the coffee, Stephanie tried to make small talk. You have a wonderful husband, Mrs. Williams. He looks after your interests so well. Yes. Elizabeth looked her straight in the eye. It's amazing how he manages to combine taking care of me and meeting you at the Plaza Hotel. Stephanie froze. Excuse me? At that moment, the door opened. But instead of Richard, Donovan entered, accompanied by 2 policemen. Good afternoon, Miss Morrison. May I see your papers? Stephanie stood up abruptly. What's going on? Richard. But Richard, who was on his way back with coffee, was already standing in the doorway, detained by the other officers. Sit down, Donovan said calmly. We're going to have a long talk. I don't understand anything. Richard tried to keep his composure. Elizabeth, what does this mean? She slowly stood up. It means the game is over, darling. I know everything. About you, about Stephanie, about your previous wife. What previous wife? About Caroline Baker from Boston, Elizabeth interrupted him. About how you married her, and then she mysteriously died, leaving you all her property. Richard's face turned deathly pale. This is slander. I'm going to sue. With whom? Donovan asked calmly. With the Boston police, who had just reopened the investigation into Caroline's case? Or with the detectives who recorded all your conversations with Stephanie about your plans to take over Elizabeth's property? Stephanie suddenly laughed. You can't prove anything. Really? Elizabeth pulled out a tape recorder from her purse. Even the recording of your conversation yesterday about how best to mix my sleeping pills? Richard took a step toward her, but the policeman stopped him. Elizabeth, dear, this is a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? She looked at the man she had once loved. 15 years of lies is a misunderstanding? Plans to rob me of everything my parents left me is a misunderstanding? Miss Morrison, Mr. Williams, the police officer stepped forward. You are under arrest on suspicion of fraud and attempted unlawful taking of property. You have the right to remain silent. While the police read them their rights, Elizabeth looked out the window. It was starting to rain outside, just like when she had said yes to Richard at the altar 15 years earlier. Are you okay? Donovan asked quietly. You know, she replied, not taking her eyes off the window, for the first time in years, I'm really okay. 6 months had passed. Elizabeth sat in her father's office, sorting through old photographs. Richard and Stephanie's case was nearing completion. The prosecutor was confident of a conviction. More coffee, miss? Martha appeared in the doorway with a tray. Thank you, Elizabeth smiled at the old housekeeper. You know, I'm only now beginning to realize how wise my father was. He always wanted to protect you. Martha put the cup on the table, even when he knew there wasn't much time left. Elizabeth picked up the family photo album. He foresaw everything, even that I might not believe his warnings. That's why he left the evidence in a safe place. The housekeeper sat down next to her. You know, on the day of the accident, he told me, Martha, the time will come when Elizabeth will realize that real power is not in money, but in the ability to protect herself. The phone rang on the table. It was Donovan. Elizabeth, I have news. The Boston police have found new evidence in Caroline's case. It turns out that Richard and Stephanie met in college. They planned all their operations together. How many other victims were there? 3 so far, including you. But the investigation is ongoing. Elizabeth looked out the window at the garden where she used to walk with her parents. You know what's the strangest thing? I don't feel pain anymore. Only gratitude. To my parents, to you, to Detective Brooks. You did everything yourself, the lawyer said gently. You found the strength to resist the deception. After the conversation, Elizabeth went down to the garden. Autumn painted the trees in gold and crimson. Martha was waiting for her near the old gazebo with an envelope. This was found among your father's things. It says, "Open when it's over." With trembling hands, Elizabeth opened the envelope. Dear daughter, if you are reading this letter, it means you made it. I always knew that you had the same strength in you that your mother had, the strength to defend what was really important. Money is just a tool, my daughter. True wealth is the ability to distinguish truth from lies, loyalty from betrayal. You know this better than most now. I want you to use your experience for the benefit of others. This envelope contains documents on the establishment of a fund to help victims of financial fraud. I have prepared everything you need. All you need to do is to breathe life into this idea. Remember, every dark streak in life is a lesson, and you, my dear, have proved to be a capable student. Love, Dad. Elizabeth clutched the letter to her chest. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but they were not tears of grief, but of purification. Martha, she said, wiping her eyes, it looks like we have a lot of work to do. Yes, miss, and that's wonderful. That evening, Elizabeth sat in her father's chair for a long time, looking at the documents about the new foundation. Outside the window, the first snow was falling, covering the ground with a pure white blanket. Nature was giving a new beginning. Sometimes, she thought, we need to go through betrayal to understand the value of loyalty, through lies to learn to appreciate the truth, through loss to find our true purpose. A new life was ahead of her, a life in which she would finally become the strong woman her father had always seen her as.